Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie Moab Investigation Part 7. Officer Eric Pratt's Interview Notes. How many years of law enforcement experience do you have, and how long have you been with the Moab Police Department? 16 years total, ? With Moab. Did you have access to your body-worn camera video and dispatch call information when preparing your report? I had access to the body-worn camera footage. I did not have access to the 911 audio. Has to request that, and sometimes it takes weeks. Said they have the dispatch notes at the time and the call unless you copy and paste the notes into a Word document, which he didn't do. Said Moab uses FatPot and GSCO uses Spillman. Due to the two different softwares being utilized, once the call is closed out, they are no longer able to see the notes associated with the call. Did you review your body-worn camera video prior to or during the time you were preparing your report? He doesn't recall. States there is a log that would show whether or not he reviewed it. He stated it was pretty common for him to review his body camera footage. How many calls are you aware of that were made to dispatch regarding this incident? I'm only aware of one. How were you notified about this incident? Dispatch broadcast information on the radios, making it so everyone could hear. Questions from the written report. When speaking with witness at the Moonflower Co-op, did you have your body camera activated? No, I did not have it activated at the Moonflower, not that I recall. If I did, then it would have been uploaded, but I don't think it was. Could have been, but I don't think it was. Did witness report anything to you while you were with him at the Moonflower that's different than when you talked to him on the phone? No, he didn't tell me anything at the Moonflower. I went to the Moonflower to find the reporting party that actually called, and when I got there, there was no one there. He stated that is why he didn't start his body camera. He was walking back to his car, and a guy yelled out at him, asking him if he was there for the domestic. Officer said that he was getting in his vehicle at this point, and he asked the guy if he was the one that called the incident in. The witness said he wasn't, but he saw what happened. He asked him for his name and phone number so he could call him later to get a statement from him. He told him what was most important right now was to describe the white van and ask if there was anything that stuck out. Officer Pratt stated white vans are extremely common in Moab and wanted information he could put out over the radio to help narrow down the search. He told Pratt that the van had a backpack attached to the back of the van. Officer Pratt relayed that information to dispatch to assist in the search. Pratt said at this time, Officer wrote that he had located a vehicle matching the description with a Florida plate, so Pratt didn't have time to obtain the witness's statement. Pratt told the witness he would call him later for a statement and responded to the location where Robbins had the vehicle stopped. Officer Pratt went on to explain that he thought the witness was going to have a story consistent with that of the individual who called 911 and stated he assumed incorrectly that I was going to have two statements from two different witnesses that are pretty similar, and that's what I was going off of when I ended up on that stop. Pratt stated that typically when you have two independent witnesses to an incident, the stories are usually pretty similar. In your report, you stated it wasn't clear, but I believe it was reported that the male had been observed to have assaulted the female. Can you explain what wasn't clear and why it wasn't clear? Officer Pratt asked, do you know if that statement is referring to whether or not the caller had not made that clear or whether or not it was? Whether or not generally it wasn't clear because I had two conflicting witnesses. I told him that was up to him to answer, and I showed his report to him, and pointed out where the statement was made. The only thing I can say about the way that was written is it has to be after I wrote this report, after the incident was completed, and by the time the incident was completed, I knew I had one person saying the opposite of another person, and those are my two independent witnesses. So to me, that's why I would have written it, and it wasn't clear. Officer Pratt went on to explain that when he writes a report, he writes it with the thought in mind that he is writing it for someone who wasn't there and didn't see anything. So he tries to make it so anyone who is reading it can understand kind of what happened. Officer Pratt said by the time he was writing this report, it still was not clear, because I have one caller that called in and said one thing, and I have another person that made a report over the phone that said the opposite. So it wasn't clear at the time that I wrote the report. I clarified with Officer Pratt that the statement wasn't specific to the 911 reporting party. No. Officer Pratt brought up it had been 2 months since the incident and stated that after he read the report, that is what he believed he meant by it. He said at the time the report was written, it still wasn't clear to me because I had 2 witnesses saying opposite things. So therefore, I don't think it could be clear to the reader. While talking to Gabby, she reported to you that Brian grabbed her face, which caused a scratch on the left side of her face. In your report, you state, no one reported that the male struck the female. After being notified by dispatch of the reported incident, as well as Gabby telling you what happened, how did you come to the conclusion in your report that nobody reported Brian struck Gabby? Officer Pratt explained that the people he spoke to were Brian, Gabby, and an independent witness. None of them reported that. Officer Pratt explained that since he couldn't go back and listen to the dispatch audio, has to be formally requested and it takes time, he was out with them for an hour, dispatched to an urgent call of someone drunk and laying in traffic, and many more calls after this, and by the time he was able to write his report in the middle of the night, he recalls having 3 consistent stories, none of which was that Brian hit Gabby, but rather they were all saying Gabby hit Brian. Officer Pratt stated by that time he started to question himself on if he had even heard the audio from dispatch correctly. He was wondering if he had heard it wrong or if they dispatched it wrong based on the statements he received during the call. Officer Pratt added that he's been pre-programmed to hear a dude's hitting a woman. So with all those factors, it made him second guess if he was recalling the dispatch information correctly. Brian said the one thing he knew for sure was out of the 3 people he talked to, none of them reported Brian hitting Gabby. Officer Pratt then explained that they all said Brian grabbed Gabby's face. Brian said that Brian, Gabby, and witnesses' statements were strangely consistent. I don't recall the witness or Brian stating this. I told Officer Pratt that I didn't recall them all stating Brian had grabbed Gabby's face. Officer Pratt went through what he could recall with Brian's statement. Officer Pratt recalled Brian stating that he was pushing Gabby back when she was hitting him with the cell phone. He then said, "It seems to me," he said it, "but to be honest with you, I haven't watched that body cam footage since September the 11th, when I was called by the Northport police and wanted information on it." He went and looked for the report to refresh his memory, and he couldn't see his supplemental report. He didn't know why his report wasn't coming up when he did the search query at the time. He thought maybe he hadn't done a supplemental report. Officer Pratt said he actually watched the body cam footage on September the 11th, so he could do a supplemental report. Officer Pratt said he did a supplemental report after watching the body cam footage, and the next day he was asked by Sergeant Newmer and Adair why he had 2 supplemental reports on this case. Officer Pratt said he told them he thought he had written one, but when he went to read it to refresh his memory and answer questions for Northport Police, he didn't see it there. He said he was told that there was 2 supplemental reports by him, one from the day it happened and the one he typed up after watching the body cam footage. Officer Pratt said he told them they could either keep them both, or if they are only keep one of them, they should keep the original, as that was written while things were fresher on his mind. They deleted the newer report he typed up and kept the original. Officer Pratt said that was the last time he watched the body cam footage. Officer Pratt said again he really thought Brian had mentioned grabbing Gabby's face, but he could be wrong. He said he does know Brian admitted to pushing Gabby, and he said he remembers this specifically because it was important for him to find out when Brian pushed Gabby, further explaining that if someone is hitting you and you push them, it's self-defense. However, if you push someone and then they hit you, then that's not self-defense. I asked Officer Pratt about his statement again that nobody reported that the male hit the female, despite the statements of Brian grabbing her face and causing a scratch. I asked Officer Pratt if he took that literally and didn't consider someone grabbing a face a strike or a hit. Officer Pratt confirmed that he didn't consider someone grabbing a face as a hit or a strike. He gave examples of a hit being a hit and a slap being a slap, etc. Officer Pratt explained that he believed it was very important when we interview people, stating that maybe we could have done better at this. To figure out what kind of contact was made, and gave examples of open hand, closed hand, with the weapon, punch, slap, grab, etc. He explained the importance of it as it relates to injuries that are caused and observed. He further explained the importance of this information as it relates to what they're doing and not doing, arrest or no arrest. Officer Pratt said that although he doesn't consider a grab to the face a strike, he stated that it could be an assault. Officer Pratt said it depended on what was going on. Officer Pratt then went on to explain the definition of assault, stating it was an attempt with unlawful force or violence to do bodily injury to somebody. Regarding the scratch on Gabby's face, Officer Pratt said, if that scratch was a result of a face grab that was intended to cause, with unlawful intent, to cause bodily injury, so yes, for me, I think the definition between a punch, a slap, and a face grab are important, but they're also important based on what's going on. When any of those things happen, that's my opinion. Gabby explained to you that Brian hit her and described it through demonstration because you asked, but did he hit you? Did he hit you? And she said yes, but then she described it as a squeeze. Officer Pratt said as he recalls it, Gabby never actually said yes, but instead she said, well, I definitely hit him first. There are 2 different times in the video. The first time, that is how she replies. The second time she said, I guess, but I hit him first. Officer Pratt said that is what he recalls, and to him, it still means that Brian did hit her. Officer Pratt said he's not trying to get too much into detail, but thinks it's important that if she did say yes, that he doesn't recall it even after watching the video since then. He repeated again that he only recalls Gabby saying, "Well, I definitely hit him first," and said, "Tomato, tomato." It implies he hit her, fine. Gabby described it their demonstration of Brian grabbing her face and squeezing. Why wasn't there any follow-up with Brian regarding this statement of Brian grabbing Gabby's face? Officer Pratt stated that he really thought there had been. Pratt said he didn't know there wasn't. He went on to explain the follow-up that had occurred with the witness and said he didn't know all of the things Officer Robbins said to Brian. Wasn't there for the majority of the interaction between Officer Robbins and Brian. Officer Pratt said he did tell Officer Robbins that Gabby reported Brian grabbing her face, and that he did go off and talk to Brian. I shouldn't make these assumptions, but I assumed that he addressed it and it was corroborated and should have talked to Brian more about that. One issue I have with this situation is people say, these cops, they tried. They were there for an hour on the side of the road. Some of these calls require more than that. And this was one of those calls where I wished we had more time. I wish I hadn't been called away. I wish I didn't feel like I had to rush it all. But I'm out alone in a town of 5,000 with an annual increase of 3 to 5 million tourists, and I have a rookie that I have to watch after. And I get called to a drunk guy laying in the road, and there's a lot. I wish it would have happened differently. Like one other guy on duty, I could have stayed and helped more with this call and gone over some stuff and not felt rushed. If I didn't talk to Brian about that, or if it wasn't followed up with Brian, that should have happened for sure. I guess I assumed it had. I didn't know it hadn't. In your report, you put that this incident was more accurately categorized as a mental and emotional health break than a domestic assault. Please explain how you reached this conclusion. Officer Pratt explained they both claimed to suffer from mental health issues. Officer Pratt said he never found out if they were clinically diagnosed or self-diagnosed, but said that there was evidence of such that he believed after interacting with both of them. Pratt went on to explain that he has numerous kids of his own and said that for many years he has interacted with all types of people on the spectrum, from drug addicts to professionals, and said he can tell when he's dealing with someone who suffers from some type of illness. Officer Pratt said he isn't a doctor, but said that Gabby was clearly suffering. Officer Pratt said Gabby was anxious, so he would say she had anxiety. Gabby didn't want to be separated from Brian, so there may have been some codependency issues. Officer Pratt said Gabby wasn't a calm person who's collected, of sound mind, who knows themselves and knows what they're doing. Again, admitting to not being a doctor, Officer Pratt said he observed what he believed were mental health issues from Brian from the very beginning. Some of the things that he was saying and the way he was talking and acting, I saw the dynamics of their relationship. And I saw some things that, I'll be honest, I'll be 100% honest, I didn't. If there were all these red flags that he was going to murder Gabby, I didn't see those. I saw the same red flags I see every time I get called to a relationship issue. They don't call us because they're doing great and want a police officer to come over and see how great they're doing. They call us because something is devolved, and then there's all these red flags. And if you do this job long enough, hey, there's that red flag again. And what I saw with Gabby and Brian was another unhealthy relationship. Now, usually that doesn't end in murder. So if someone out there says you should have seen he was going to kill her, great. Tell them to come and make $25 an hour and do this for me. Officer Pratt said he saw mental health issues on both sides, and if it was not an assault, which I decided it wasn't, then what else could it? Then what could I call it? They say they're mentally unsound. It wasn't an assault. If it was an assault, she would have had to be arrested. But there's elements to the offense of assault, and you have to meet those. Just like when you tell a judge, hey, I've met these elements. Court's not adjourned because the cop said it. Now the judge has to make sure the elements are really met. Well, it starts with the cop. So one of the elements for the offense of assault is an attempt with unlawful force or violence to do bodily injury to another. Officer Pratt continued, stating that this is why they asked Gabby, what was your attempt? What were you intending to do? Officer Pratt says some people may think he is stupid because, duh, there was injury. So what do you think? He has redness all over him. He had scratches all over him. There's an injury. Of course it was an assault. Officer Pratt provided a scenario of him taking a photograph while backing up on the sidewalk and backing into someone else who falls off the curb and into the gutter. The person who falls skins their knee and has injuries. Officer Pratt asked, is that an assault? Is there an attempt with unlawful force or violence to do injury to you? Or was I careless and made a mistake and maybe you weren't looking, like this is just an accident? Officer Pratt further explains that if he is negligent enough, then maybe there could be some liability if through that negligence it caused injury to another person. Officer Pratt said he wanted to find out from Gabby her intentions because he's bigger, he's stronger, he's older, and he clearly has influence over her mentality that looked unsavory to me, and all I could see from Gabby is she wanted to gain and try to maintain some equality in this relationship that I think she knew she didn't have. And when someone smaller and more frail is trying to get an equal setting at the table with somebody who has all of the power and dynamics are kind of in their favor, because he's mentally messing with her, hanging her backpack outside, saying you need to go take a walk, and saying weird things to us, like, what if I touch your radio? Like he was a weird, not healthy dude. And that was clear. And she clearly was needing to be with him. And at the same time, it's clear to me that she smacked the crap out of him. So what's going on here? Is she abusive to Brian? He killed her. Who's the abuser? If you mentally and emotionally abuse somebody, can I charge you? If you physically abuse somebody, can I charge you? Yes, clearly physical abuse, I can charge you. What I didn't want to see happen to Gabby, and unfortunately, maybe something far worse did happen. And maybe the same thing would have happened, and maybe, I don't know. What I didn't want to see that day was her take all of the criminal responsibility for this incident upon herself at 22 years old. Maybe she wants to go get a state certification somewhere, get a license for her job. Maybe she just doesn't want to have a criminal record. Maybe she wants to go hunting. Maybe I just didn't want a 22-year-old girl who I felt like was trying to all she wanted to do was have an equal. I think she wanted to gain equality in that relationship with Brian and have some way to have the power and dynamics more even. And as a guys our size, we think, well, you can't slap people to do that. Yeah, well, we've never been a 110-pound female with what was her intent was up in the air for me. Let's just put it that way. What was her intent? If Brian says, I hit her, I wasn't trying to hurt her, I'm sorry. We see the power and dynamics there. It's not believable. But when someone that size, who's in that situation, who's slapping her boyfriend, says, I just wanted him to stop telling me to calm down, it actually sounded reasonable to me. Now that can be crazy, and that's probably the biggest thing people are going to say, is that's bullshit. It just sounded kind of reasonable that she wanted him to stop behaving the way he was behaving towards her. And it wasn't like she really thought she was going to do him bodily injury and any significant extent or really hard. He's a lot bigger and stronger. And to me, I believed her. She said, I just wanted him to stop telling me to calm down. And in other words, I think she wanted to have some equality in that relationship. And I don't think she had the tools in her toolbox to figure out how to do that in any other way than just start slapping him. Not okay. She could go to jail, sure. Could I make the case that she assaulted him? Absolutely. Could it go to court? And a judge could do something crazy and say, I don't think she really assaulted him like I did? Because that's what I did. I said, I don't think she assaulted him because I don't think she had the intent behind it to do bodily injury to him. I think she wanted to modify his behavior, and she doesn't have the tools in her toolbox to do it. So it seemed reasonable when she said that is what she wanted. So one of the elements of the offense is missing. So we don't have an assault. So what do we have? Well, they hand-fed me. They both have mental issues. So that's why I said we had a mental health crisis. I followed the evidence, and if it was an assault, it must be a mental health issue. That's what I looked at it like, and maybe it was wrong. But I didn't want Gabby to suffer the whole weight of this. And another thing I'll say, it did cross my mind that when he bailed her out the next day, like he said he was going to, when it comes down to the police department and signs away the little paperwork that says they can't hang out anymore, it did occur to me at that time that he's gone, because he mentioned in the video. I remember he said, and I didn't hear him say this to Robbins, but I got the impression, and we found out later that it's true. They didn't have a lot of money. So, if he's going to go bail her out, is he going to have more control over her now? Now we're out of money. Blame it on her because I had to bail you out. You know, all it's going to do is put the power and dynamics more on him in his favor, where he's like, now we have to come back to court or video court. Now we don't have the money because I had to bail you out. Oh, we're in another fight. Go ahead, call the cops. How did that go for you last time? They hauled you off because I'm too cute. Because I said crisscross applesauce. So they didn't arrest me. You know, as grown men, we laugh about how absurd that would be to think for him that he got away with it for being cute. He didn't get away with anything for being cute. We saw his stupid bullshit. He got away with what he got away with on August the 12th here because I couldn't charge him with a straight face. No judge, if I wrote my PC statement correctly, would sign off on his incarceration that day. I would have to omit things from my report or put the entire purpose for the arrest on the caller that drove by. I would have to disregard the physical evidence. I would have to disregard his statement, Gabby's statement, and another independent person's statement to put him in jail. And for a scuff on her face that would not have been visible the next day when everyone I talked to claimed that it was a face grab while she was wailing on him with a phone in her hand, it's not assault. If you reverse the roles and a man is actually hitting her, a woman, and she grabs his face and leaves a fingernail mark, and she's as beat up as he was, and I took her to jail and tried to book her in, and the judge said, well, she's all beat up. Well, yeah, but she scuffed the dude's face. She grabbed his chin while he was hitting her. It's absurd. I'm sorry. If it's good for the dude, it's good for the girl. That's the way society wants us to play this domestic game. They want us to treat men and women the same. Well, guess what? Reverse the roles and tell me I should take Gabby to jail if she had all the injuries on her Brian had, and if all he had was a scuff from when she grabbed his face while he was hitting her. I'm sorry. I can't put him in jail, so I didn't. I'd have to lie or omit something and convince a judge to sign that PC statement. The only person that could have gone to jail was Gabby. And I didn't think it was right, you know. I will die on this hill if it was wrong for me to not arrest her. I still wouldn't have arrested her, sorry. Brian was as much responsible or more for what happened that day. She is at a disadvantage in every way, emotionally, mentally, physically, and yes, she slapped him, and he probably deserved every slap he got. If she could have gone to jail, and that's what should have happened, kick me out of the police department, cool. I'll go back to being a drywaller, where the worst thing I can do is mess up a joint. You know, I don't care. I wouldn't have done it any different. I gave Daniel the opportunity to make those decisions. I kind of steered him the way I thought was right, and if he would have arrested her, I would have been fine with it. But I like that he didn't arrest her, even knowing now that she was murdered later. If it had been the next day or a few days later, or still in Moab, okay, I would feel really weird, like maybe it really could have changed something. But I don't know. 18 days later, 500 miles away, after he disengaged with her for 6 days to go back to Florida, I just don't think that charging her would have done anything but make the last few weeks of her life more miserable with this guy as he punished her more before he killed her anyway. Now that's what I think. I don't know. Maybe by us taking her, she would have, oh, I'm breaking up with him. Maybe that would have been the end of it. I can't guess today any better than I could have guessed that day. I still don't think that she should have got those charges, and I didn't want her to. Your report states no charges were filed, and no one wished for charges to be filed or for the separation to take place, although the minimum what Officer Robbins required in lieu of making a case against Gabby for domestic assault. Do you believe a domestic violence assault took place during this incident? I believe that my position as a police officer on the front line of anything that ends up in court, there's a basic whether or not we have discretion on something like this. we are expected to use our common sense and figure out just basically whether or not there's a charge to be supported, and in that way, we kind of screen that stuff. And to answer your question, one cop will go to that call and say this is absolutely an assault, and another cop will go to that call, and because he has a different point of view, he might say it's not. And then our duty is to document and support with reasoning, logic, and hopefully the law backing us, because we all read the same code, why we chose to do the arrest or not do the arrest. And the better you are at that, usually the better cop you are. But everyone makes mistakes or reads something wrong, or you might send 100 cops to that call and they all say she should be arrested, for example, and then you send 100 and 80 of them think she shouldn't have. I do not know the answer to that. I know that I had determined that one of the elements for assault was missing. That was for her to use unlawful force or violence, attempt to use unlawful force or violence to cause bodily injury to Brian. When we talked about attempt something, implicit with attempt is intent. You can't attempt something with no intent to do it. So obviously, intent is part of assault, which is what we talked about earlier. For me, one of the elements was missing, and so I looked at it and I don't think we have an assault here. Now another cop would look at that and say, I don't believe Gabby. I think she wanted to cause him bodily harm and that's why she hit him. Now, this is an opinion because nobody can get in Gabby's head and find out what her intent was. That's why we spend so much time in court, way more than I have on the side of the road. They have entire days of trial spent nothing more than just establishing intent on a crime. I don't have special expert witnesses on the side of the road. I don't have 5 days of my trial with these people to figure out who to charge. I got like less than an hour apparently. So they trust me after 16 years to figure it out. And I took my 16 years of experience and I said I believe Gabby based on the totality of the circumstances and based on what she appears physically capable of, and based on what I saw him doing and act the way he was acting, that I don't think she assaulted him. I think she didn't assault him because part of assault is an attempt with unlawful force or violence to cause bodily injury to him. The result was some bodily injury to him. That was the result. What was the intent? She said to me, I wanted him to stop telling me to calm down. And I just believed her. I believe her based on everything I saw. So no, I don't think we had an assault. In cases of domestic violence, if the victim doesn't want charges to be filed, in what circumstances can you honor those wishes? If we have something that has been called and supported by code as domestic assault, we do not have discretion to not file the charge. There is a shall attached. Doesn't necessarily have to be custody, but has to be that or citation. How can Officer Robbins lawfully require a separation to take place in lieu of making a case against Gabby for domestic assault? He can't. He can't. If you're not going to charge them, you can't. He required it. He didn't say by law. They didn't ask. As far as I know, you can't require someone to separate. He feels like if they gave any indication they weren't going to follow that advice, then Officer Robbins would have made the other case for the safety of both of them. And obviously, we found out, ultimately for her safety, but we do have to consider his safety. He was the one that was marked up. So at the time, without the hindsight of him murdering her, as we assume is what happened, We were worried for both of their safety. Just because Brian was unsavory, I didn't necessarily like his vibe. Doesn't mean we don't look out for his safety. She could have caused an accident. She was apparently hitting or pulling on his arm while he was driving, such that he hit the curb. If we believe what she said and he said, which may or may not be true, but I don't have 5 days of court to figure that out. So based on the evidence on his arm, on his right arm, which was on her side, with the scratches and the redness, it looks like someone was going to town on that arm, and he did hit a curb. So what we call this is physical evidence lining up with our observations. That's the best we can go off of. So even for his safety. At the end of the conclusion of your report, you put EOS EMP. What does this mean? End of supplemental. Eric M. Pratt. Questions from the body-worn camera. Thank you so much for watching. If you're not already a subscriber here, please take a moment and subscribe. Give us a thumbs up. And until next time, this is UnJustified.